Good morning, everyone. Is volume good? Everyone can hear me? Perfect. Thank you. So this morning, I am subbing in for Zach today. I'm very thankful for the opportunity. And today I will be talking about the topic of faith. In particular, looking at the faith of Joseph. It's been on my mind a lot lately, and I'm pretty excited to talk about it. And I'm going to hope that technology will work with me today. Yes. Okay, great. So, to start, I'd like to begin with looking at what faith actually is, biblically speaking. And so the word faith used in the New Testament is the word pistis, which just means the conviction of the truth of anything. It is something that you are sure of, you believe it. That is the word faith that's used. Persuasion, just when you are certain that you know something is true. The Bible also provides its own description of faith in Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is the assurance, some translations use the word substance, of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And the word substance here is this word hypostasis. And it's a fancy word for the things that are put under, the substructure foundation. It is the idea of when you're building a house, you must first start with the slab, with the foundation. From that, you can build everything off of it. In the same way, faith is the reason why we as Christians do the things that we do. Additionally, faith is not just something that lives in your head. Faith connotes action. It's something that while the things that we believe in may not be visibly seen, our faith can be seen. And so when we look at the New Testament, there's a lot of descriptions of faith. When we look at the Old Testament, what we really see more than anything is the examples of faith that are shown by things that people at that time did. And so, in particular, we will be looking at Joseph. And we will be spending a lot of time in the Word, so I would invite you to open your heavenly libraries to Genesis chapter 37, which I will begin reading. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. So Joseph was the 11th son of the patriarch Jacob, the firstborn of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. He was gifted by God. He was very blessed with the ability to steward well. He also had the ability to interpret dreams, which was a very unique gift for him. He was very promising. He was young. He was responsible. He was favored by his father, which at this time in particular was very unusual. Typically, the firstborn son is the one who is favored because that was the guarantee that the family name is going to be carried on, the family heritage. The firstborn son would actually receive a double portion of the inheritance, and if anything were to happen to the father, that firstborn son would take over as the family patriarch. And you look at the case of Joseph, Jacob doesn't look at his second son or his third son, but he skips all of them and goes all the way down to the 11th son, Joseph, whom he favors. So things are seeming well for Joseph. However, he was hated by his own brothers. Joseph would be what we would probably call today the golden child. As a show of this, his father made for him a custom robe of many colors, and as a show of favor over his brothers. But for those of you who have siblings, imagine if they received some kind of a special custom gift, something that was probably expensive, and you got nothing. How would that make you feel? Additionally, as a shepherd boy alongside of his brothers, Joseph would bring a bad report of his brothers as they were shepherding, bringing it back to his father. And very well, Joseph was likely just reporting the things that he saw. But nevertheless, his brothers hated him for that. To add insult to injury, Joseph has two dreams. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into the dreams we were discussing, but just the interpretations. But the dreams are interpreted to show that one day his 11 brothers, his mother, and his father would all bow down to him. And especially in this time, it was believed that dreams held meaning. And so we have Joseph here in his youth. While he was very promising and young, he was also somewhat naive. Just because he received these dreams and received this knowledge, he didn't have to share it, but possibly seeking to elevate his standing or to show off his importance to his brothers, he tells them and he tells his father as well, to which they rebuke him. And frankly, I think this is kind of the thing that really broke the straw that broke the camel's back between his brothers and himself. I mean, his brothers already could not speak peacefully to him, and so then he adds on this dream, essentially telling them that, hey, one day you guys are going to bow down to me. So then later, Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers who are pasturing the flock, likely because Jacob trusted Joseph the most and wanted him to bring back word about how everything was going with his brothers. So Jacob sends him, and then upon Joseph's arrival, his brothers plan to kill him. After some consideration and some discussion, they instead decide to capture Joseph and sell him into slavery in order to get rid of him and to ensure the inheritance and the favoritism all for themselves. So Joseph, who was blessed with talent, favored by his father, had everything going for him, suddenly had all of that stripped away from him. He's forced to go into a foreign land as a slave, and then in the way that it happens is that he is utterly betrayed by his own blood and alone. So that's the beginning of Joseph's life. Now, continuing forward into Genesis chapter 39, I'm going to go ahead and read it. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of the Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From this time that he made him an overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in his house and the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. To give a little bit of information about Potiphar, the description we're given is he is an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. That word officer is actually the word eunuch. And this was a very typical practice in ancient times, is that the royal officials, the men who were around the king and the queen, would become eunuchs because they couldn't have sexual feelings toward the queen. And so we know Potiphar, he was a eunuch. He was also captain of the guard, i.e. the bodyguard of Pharaoh. Some translations render executioner. Regardless, he had people under his authority who knew how to kill. It's in this chapter that it is first mentioned that the Lord, all capitalized Lord Jehovah, the name of the one true God, that he was with Joseph and caused him all to succeed. And I mean, as you can see in some of the underlines up here, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was the one who caused all of these things to happen. He blessed the Egyptian's house, and that the blessing of the Lord was on all that he did. And it's just a reminder that even though Joseph at that time seemed completely alone, he still had the Lord there. The Lord was still with Joseph. And we also know that the Lord was still with Joseph even in his youth because of the dreams he received. Those came from God. And that God was the reason for Joseph's success, and Joseph credited God for that success. Not only this, but Potiphar himself saw that the Lord was with Joseph, an Egyptian who would not be familiar with the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Now, I believe that it is safe to assume that the reason that Potiphar saw this is because Joseph talked about God, that he gave credit where credit was due for his gifts, especially of stewardship. And it is very cool. Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything except what he was putting into his mouth. Literally everything else was taken care of. That's how good of a steward that Joseph was. And so all seems well in Potiphar's household until we get to the second half of verse 6, which reads, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?' And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her." Now again, drawing back to the point, Potiphar was a eunuch. This may also provide some indication as to why his wife was doing what she was doing. Joseph was also young and handsome and had everything going for him. And the rest of the chapter, Joseph is alone with Potiphar's wife. When he refuses her again, she grabs his garment and holds on to it. And then Joseph flees. And then whenever Potiphar comes back home, she essentially cries rape, and she accuses Joseph of trying to assault her. And then Potiphar is forced to put Joseph into prison because of this, which Potiphar's anger was kindled, but I don't necessarily believe it was at Joseph. Again, Potiphar was in charge of executioners, people who could kill. It would seem to be a miracle that Potiphar didn't have him executed right there on the spot. And yet, instead, Joseph is put into prison, which relatively would be a lighter form of punishment. And I think that's also just a show of the type of favor that Joseph had with Potiphar. But even still, Potiphar did have to show some form of punishment in order to maintain his face and the name of his wife. The two main points I'd like to draw from this segment are, firstly, that Joseph's arguments, while they were valid and he was sincere, they were not effective. One of his reasons was that he had respect for his master, that he was in charge of everything, that all things were given to him except for his master's wife. Clearly, this did not mean very much to Potiphar's wife. And then additionally, that he did not want to sin against God, which again, very valid reason. He was showing his faith to God in that moment. And yet, for a pagan wife, this doesn't mean very much. So while Joseph's intentions were good and they were true, we know they didn't work because she continued to come to him day after day. And it got to the point where all he could do was just try and ignore her. Now, it doesn't say that he specifically asked God for help here. I'm sure it would have helped. But this was the situation that he was in. Additionally, the second point I would like to draw from this section actually comes later in verses, I'll just read it, verses 21 through 23, which reads, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." So this is after Joseph has been put into prison. "And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made him succeed." Again, even while being delivered out of a well-established household, being second in command, which very big improvement from being sold into slavery in the first place. Now he is put into prison. The Lord was still with Joseph and showed him steadfast love by giving him favor in the sight of the prison guard. And, you think about it, Joseph received dreams. He could interpret dreams. God did not send a vision or a dream to Joseph saying, hey, everything's going to be okay. He's having to work through this the whole time with trust. And I'm sure there was times where Joseph had his doubts, or his faith may have wavered. And yet we see time and again, Joseph gives the glory to God and trusts that he knows what he's doing. And so then we get to Joseph in prison, which is already up on the screen. And I will go ahead and read through this. So we get to chapter 40, starting in verse 1. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against the Lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody of his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." We see Joseph's continued pattern of stewardship. In the case of Potiphar, in the case of Jacob, in the case of the keeper of the prison, none of them had any concerns about the things that were placed under Joseph's care. Sometime after being in prison, though, the Pharaoh is angry at his cupbearer and baker. The roles of those two men were to, one, prepare the food and the drink for the Pharaoh, and to test it to ensure that there wasn't any poison, that it was safe for the king or the Pharaoh to consume. And so we do not know specifically why or what the offense was that these two were accused of against the Pharaoh. But, it could have been potentially an assassination attempt because they were so close to the food. We don't know. But regardless, they are both being held in custody while an investigation is being taken place. And then the two have these dreams. And Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God. Tell the dreams to me." So Joseph interprets the dreams. For the cupbearer, in 3 days, the cupbearer would be restored to his original right position as cupbearer to the Pharaoh, whereas in 3 days, the baker would be hanged. And when Joseph is telling the cupbearer, "Hey, you're going to be back in the king's palace in a few days, please remember me and bring me, let me know, let the king know so that, hey, maybe I could get out of prison." I'm sure that was the thought that was going through Joseph's mind in that moment. But then we will get to see in the following chapter that it would take a little while before that would occur. In fact, it would take 2 full years for Joseph to finally be released from prison from this instance. And so, continuing forward, in chapter 41, starting in verse 9, "Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, 'I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said that that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it.' Joseph answered Pharaoh, 'It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer.'" So put yourself in the place of Joseph. He just spoke with the cupbearer to the Pharaoh, the highest authority in Egypt, correctly interpreted the dream to restore him to his rightful place, tells him, hey, when this happens, remember me. And then 2 years go by, and there is no progress. Joseph is still in the prison doing the duties that he was doing before. I mean, that seems like it could be just like, oh, well, I guess this is not going to be how I get out of here. I mean, if it's going to take you get past year one, it's like, okay, well, this guy's clearly forgotten about me. I could definitely see it seeming hopeless in that moment. And yet, Joseph still continues doing the things that he was supposed to do. And so then the chief cupbearer remembers Joseph whenever Pharaoh receives the dreams. And then Joseph is brought before the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh at this point in time would have been the closest thing to God as far as the Egyptians were concerned. And yet Joseph shows his boldness here and says, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And it's interesting because the word Lord, that's in all caps, that word Jehovah, is probably not a word that the Egyptians would have been familiar with. But the word God here is Elohim, like celestial creator. And it's something that the Egyptians could have related to much better. And so Joseph gives credit to this one Elohim. The interpretation that he gives for Pharaoh's dreams is that there will be a coming 7 years of plentiful harvest, followed by a 7 years of widespread famine. Not only does Joseph give the interpretation, but then he also recommends to Pharaoh that the overseers should that Pharaoh should appoint overseers who would then store away a fifth of the harvest for the next 7 years and as a reserve for the time of famine. And now I'm not going to read this next section in Genesis 41 just for the sake of time, but ultimately pleases Pharaoh and the servants. They all agree with Joseph. Joseph is then appointed as that overseer because the Pharaoh is able to see the Spirit of God within Joseph. And so we see a magnificent procession for Joseph as he is paraded throughout all of Egypt. And Joseph is placed second in command of the entire nation. And now Joseph was 30 years old when this happened. So from the time when he was 17 to the time when he was 30, he was either in slavery or in prison. And on that note, we will continue with this into the applications for the sermon today. So first application. We are all on God's timetable. Some people could look at Joseph's life and say he lost out on some of the best years of his life. The times when he was young, healthy, that ages 17 to 30, that's just gone. But when we look at the full picture, we see that what Joseph lost, God gave it back to him and more. He ended up living the next 80 years of his life on par with Egyptian royalty. And what we will also see is that he gained back the love and respect from his brothers that he never had. I took this phrase from someone else I was listening to. God is a slow cook. I liked the analogy. But just to convey the point that whenever we want something now, or when something that seems expedient seems good, God sometimes sees that time is what we really need more than anything. And that sometimes the best things in life will take the longest. And this was certainly the case for Joseph. And God has his own reasons. We don't always have them. And yet that is why it is so important to have faith. Continuing into the next application, God can take all things that are good and bad and work them for his good. And his good is better than our good. Romans 8:28 reads that, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called, according to his purpose. Prosperity gospel will tell you that if you're faithful, you do what you're supposed to do, only good things will happen to you. What the Bible has shown us is that in spite of the bad, in spite of the sadness, in spite of the difficulty and the challenges of life, God is able to take those things and the things that are good that happen to us and work them for his own good. Ephesians 3:20 reads that God is able to do far more abundantly than all that we can ask or think. Don't you think there was at some point in time where Joseph was just wishing, all I want is to go back and be with my family? You think about Joseph being in front of Pharaoh. He could have very well said, I'll tell you your dream. I'll tell you what your dream means. I know what it means. If you just let me go back and be home with my family, I'll tell you. And frankly, I don't think that would have been a very difficult deal to make for someone who was in prison. And yet he does not make that claim. We see that God had much greater plans for the life of Joseph. And where we really see that carried out is at the end of Genesis in chapter 50, verse 20, which reads, as for you, this is Joseph speaking to his brothers. After their father dies, they have reconciled at this point. It says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. You see, Joseph's own plan, had it gone through, would have left him tending sheep back home. That would have been the extent of his life. Could have gotten married, had a family, been a shepherd for his whole life. And yet instead, his brother's evil actions would be used to bring about the salvation and the survival of the entire nation of Egypt and the surrounding territories during 7 years of hard famine. I mean, he was able to prevent hundreds of thousands of deaths through the things that he went through. And so I think that's a very good reason to trust in God there. Going into our third application. We remain faithful to God under all circumstances because we can have assurance that God will fulfill his promises. The thing about it is that our lives can change in an instant. We see this happen multiple times throughout the life of Joseph. Whether it's being sold into slavery by his brothers, whether it was being appointed as second in command of Potiphar's household, of the prison, or of the entirety of Egypt, Joseph remained faithful regardless. And what we see is that Joseph faithfully stewarded his father's flock as a child. He stewarded Potiphar's household, the prison, and then as second command, the entirety of the nation of Egypt. And so these are the three applications that I would like for us to take home and to meditate on this week, that we are all on God's timetable, that God is able to take all things that are good and bad and work them for his good, and that we remain faithful to God under all circumstances. But my final take home today, we will see in Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, it is typically known as the Hall of Faith. We see all of these great examples of these men and women who dedicated their lives to the Lord, and you have Abel offering a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, Noah constructing the ark, Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, and then we get to Joseph. And it reads, by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Does that sound like anything we've been talking about this morning? It doesn't say that Joseph remained faithful to the Lord for 13 years while he was in slavery and in prison. But the real cool part about this section is seen at the end of Joseph's life. Starting in verse 24, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Joseph's final dying words were a show of faith. Joseph knew that the land that was promised to Abraham was the land that was east of the Nile and went all the way up to the Euphrates. That was not Egypt. They were at this point in time, they were pretty well settled in Egypt. His family was there. He lived a great rest of his life being in the presence of Egyptian royalty. And yet still, Joseph knew and trusted that God was still going to deliver the Israelites, his own flesh and blood, to the land of Canaan, not to remain in Egypt. And so the deliverance of his bones would also remain as a reminder of those who would come after him. He makes them swear, saying, you're going to do this. You're going to bring my bones with you when you go to the land of Canaan, whenever that may be. And even though Joseph did not ultimately see this promise fulfilled, he knew it would happen. In the same way, Hebrews 11:39 through 40 reads, and all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. We think of all of these people in the Old Testament. The one thing that every single one of them was promised and they were waiting for ultimately was the Messiah, the one who would come and the one who would deliver not only them, but the whole world. And that was something that they did not see. For them, the promise was not fulfilled. And yet they still trusted that even if it wasn't going to be in their lifetime, they were still going to trust that God was going to bring about this Savior. In the same way for us, and thankfully we have retrospect. We know that Jesus came, that he lived, he died, and was resurrected. And that is what we have faith in. And yet there's still a promise that is unfulfilled to us, and that is when Christ returns and judges the world. And in spite of the fact that that might not happen in our lifetimes, we can still know that it will take place. And so the invitation this morning is that, are you ready for that? When Christ comes back, are you ready? If not, we have people who are willing to talk with you and to study so that you can be ready. And it takes a leap of faith, but it is well worth it. And if there's anything that you need help with, we invite you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.